Okay, so thanks for coming for this first roundtable. So, as you know, we started this conference last year, and with Jean, we thought, okay, we need to have roundtables so that we discuss policy questions. So last year we had 2 roundtables where we were discussing some policy, and this year again, and the first is today, and tomorrow there will be another one on digital impacts in health innovation that Jean will share. Okay, so I'm just going to, so there are a few more people coming in quickly. Okay, so this table today, I think it's a very interesting topic, and I am very pleased to welcome the speakers of this roundtable, and I want really to thank them for coming. So I will first start with Philippe Bouillou to my left. So Philippe Bouillou is an economist, but more importantly, currently he's the chairman of the CEPS. So since 4 years, he's the chairman of CEPS. So CEPS in France is a committee for healthcare product pricing. So it's a very important committee that negotiates and sets the price of drugs or reimbursement drugs in France. So that's something very important when you think about economic policy in France with respect to the pharmaceutical market in particular. Then to the left of Philippe, Juliette Moisset. So Juliette is currently the Director of Economic Affairs of the LEM. So the LEM is the organism that negotiates the price of drugs with Philippe. The context, yeah, of course. So as I will explain to you very briefly, so in France, we have a framework that is voted and that is a law. And of course, within the framework, Juliette and Philippe cannot do whatever they want, okay? They have to respect this framework, but basically the LEM is the association of the professional organization that represents the pharmaceutical industry in France, which is of course a very important industry. And then to the left of Juliette, David Ridley, so he's very well known for health economist. He's a health economist from Duke Business School, and is known to have worked a lot on incentives for innovation and quality. And one of his remarkable achievements is that some of his research has been proposed and voted and became a law in the US, in particular the one that concerns the priority review vouchers at the FDA, which raised a lot of money. I have a few figures here, but maybe, I mean, it's not the topic of the question of the roundtable today, but this is very important for innovation on pharmaceuticals, which is of course important for the US, but also a lot for Europe, given the spending on pharmaceuticals in the US, that creates a lot of innovation for everybody. So thank you all for coming and accepting to be part of this roundtable. So it's a little bit in the spirit of the roundtables we want to do, and is to have some discussion between academics and practitioners from different point of view, from the point of view of the industry, from the point of view of the state or the regulator. So I think this is really a very good example of the type of discussion we want. And of course, there are a lot of things. So the question of today is raised by the recent evolution of innovation. So as you know, in pharmaceuticals, there is a lot of progress. We have gene therapies. We have a lot of scientific, we had with the COVID messenger RNA technology, which allows a lot of things. And all this progress is very useful, is going to create a lot of innovation. But of course, some of these innovations are going to be very costly. Some of them are going to lead to some sort of personalized medicine, where you're going to have a drug design for your disease and for your gene types. And of course, you can imagine that this could be very costly. So there are a lot of questions about what should be the price in such an environment. What should be the outcome of price negotiation, or in other countries, what should firms do in order to price those products? And I thought it was interesting, we thought with Jean it was interesting to talk about this because it's very important for access to innovation. But one of the issues is that it's also important to generate innovation. And that's always a difficulty with pharmaceuticals, is that the price, there is not a single price. Even within a country, you have multi-price. You have the price that the manufacturer, the innovator will obtain. You have the price that the insurer will pay. You have the price that the insurer will pay out of pocket. And then you have international effects, international spillovers, price in many countries. And of course, it's all those prices that are going to be the outcome of a big equilibrium that are important for innovation. So we have to take into account all these aspects, which make it very difficult. And even if we were starting from a white page, okay, even if we were starting from an ideal world where as an economist, we want to design the optimal price setting mechanism, the optimal regulatory mechanism, it will be already very complicated. But we also don't start with a white page. We have a lot of constraints. And so we are going to talk about this. And the last comment I would like to do before I start really the discussion with you is that, of course, we are very often as economists, we criticize a lot of bad regulations, a lot of perverse effect of regulatory rules or behavior, bad behavior of firms like collusion or whatever. Of course, Philippe or Juliette are not responsible for any of that. Okay. And that's a very hard work, for example, for the CPS in France to work within the framework. Okay, so now Philippe is going probably to start and remind us what is this framework, but there is a framework that is a law that is there and voted by the member of parliament and changes regularly every 5 years maybe, and so it's a very complex work. So maybe let's start. And so the first question, so this is a big question, okay, which pricing reimbursement model should we use in particular for innovative therapies? And maybe, Philippe, you could start with presenting us what is, as a head of CPS, what is your point of view and practice on this?
Okay, thank you, Pierre. Thank you for the question. But firstly, thank you for inviting us. And as you understand, I am not at least an economist. An economist, yes, I am, but I'm not an academic. And I'm more of a practitioner. And it's not my day-to-day activity to have exchanges with academics. So for that and for this invitation, I wanted first to thank you. Maybe to start, a few words about the French system, even though you have started to give some indications. I will be very brief. As you said, we negotiate with companies, and actually we negotiate at two different levels. We have some general principles that are set by the law, and then we negotiate with the LEM, Juliette, a global, general framework, which tells us how to implement the law. And then the second level is that we negotiate on a case-by-case approach with companies for each drug that is reimbursed in France. So that's what we do. And the general principle, the one that is set by law, is that for setting the price, we take into account, firstly, the clinical value, or more specifically, the clinical added value of a medicine. And this is appreciated by a scientific committee. We are not a scientific committee, but there is a scientific committee within the National Health Authority that uses a ranking between 1 to 5 for products according to the level of innovation that it brings about. So this is the entry point of the negotiation and of the setting of price. What is the clinical value added of a medicine? Then we look at comparators, clinical comparators, and we decide whether there should be a premium or a discount compared to this relevant clinical comparator. If I say that in that way, it seems very simple. Actually, what I said is an oversimplification. It's much more complicated, as you can imagine. But this is the general principle. Then, in this framework, the point today is to look at the specific challenges or debates that we have about the price setting of innovative and costly new drugs, new medicines. So, in terms of the specific challenges, I would underline two of them. First one is that, well, those costly products, they are indeed costly. So then there could be a question about whether we can afford it or not. But the point is that more and more often in the past few years, we have had to face some claims by pharmaceutical companies for very, very high prices. And this is the more and more so since more and more often companies pre-announce a target price that is supposed to be a global price internationally. They know that the European system, French system in particular, is different from the US one. But nonetheless, and everybody knows that price of drugs are much higher in the US than in Europe. And nonetheless, more and more often, when they come to us, they come with a claim that is more or less the US price. So this is an issue, and the first question for us is, should we accept? And my guess is that among you, some academics will say that yes, because if we do not accept, if we insist that the price should be lower in France than in the US or elsewhere, it means that we are trying to act as a free rider, because it's the US consumers that will pay for the cost of investment and R&D and the US. So my guess, but you'll tell me, and David will tell me, is that some of you would consider that we should accept to a very high price, as in the US, for instance. But the truth is that our answer to that question is no, and we don't accept. So we can have a discussion about the reason why we don't accept. We negotiate, and again, our approach is to consider clinical comparators which have already been priced in France. And this is our benchmark. This is our reference. Our benchmark is not the price in the US. So this is the first debate. There is a second challenge that I wanted to underline, is that even within our system, innovative products are becoming more and more difficult to price. This for several reasons, and I will just take two examples. The first one is gene therapies. Gene therapies, it's complex to price for several reasons. First one, from our point of view, is the principle of a one-shot product. I mean, one single administration. And you understand that what we do when we compare the cost of a treatment between a one-shot drug and a chronic treatment, it's, you cannot do it just as usual. And a second feature of those therapies that is a challenge to us is the fact that actually there is a lot of uncertainty about the effect, and more specifically about the length of the duration of the effect of this one-shot injection. So it's very complicated for those reasons. But it's not only with gene therapies that we have to face new challenges. It's also the case, for instance, with immunotherapies. And I was very interested in the previous session and about what was said about forum shopping, because I had, I had planned to insist on this issue, but it was very well explained in the previous session. But what I can tell you, we have some discussions later, is the specific challenge for price setting when you have not to negotiate one product, but 10 or maybe 20 indications, different indications for the same product. And they come to us in an order that is not random. They may, I mean, those companies, they may try to have strategic behavior and trying to anchor the negotiation by presenting to us, firstly, the indication that will help them get initially the higher prices. So this is one further challenge. So are we faced with those challenges? How do we do in practice? I will be brief. Just to tell you that we have two relatively new tools, at least in France. These are new tools, new instruments that we can mobilize. The first one is what we call performance contracts or outcomes-based payments. It seems obvious. Who is against the use of real-world data? We all support this approach. And for instance, it's one way to deal with the high uncertainty that I was referring to. Nonetheless, we have some reservations about this approach. First one is in terms of feasibility. And a second one is that there is a risk that by focusing too much on the way, the modalities of the payments, because with those performance contract comes some kind of installment payments. We pay over time depending on the success or failure of the drug to pass some test at some time. So it's the risk is if we focus too much on the way to do the payments, we will lose sight of the most fundamental question, which is what is our willingness to pay? What is the estimated value of the drug? This is more important. Then the second instrument that we can mobilize for those very innovative products, it's the cost effectiveness approach. Personally, but I'm taking, it's a personal view. This is the approach that I favor. Sorry. It provides us with a metric, which is the ICER, and it broadens the perspective that we can have when setting the price. But it also raises some difficulties, in particular when it comes to defining some specific threshold in terms on the ICER, because it raises very difficult questions, such as in terms of the price of life and so on. And my point is that it seems to me that in France we are not yet ready to adopt this approach because of the impact of questions about the price of life, for instance. But nonetheless, my view is that even without an explicit threshold, we can use effectively this kind of approach to better set the price of those innovative products. I have some other remarks, but
yes,
later on in the discussion.
I think we will come back to you. We'll have more discussion. I think it's good that you presented the framework because then Juliette does not need to repeat it because, of course, it's very French specific and not everybody knows it here. So I have a few remarks, but I will keep them for after and maybe let Juliette tell us about her own point of view and experience.
So it's not going to be very disruptive because I will be much along the line that Philippe just described. Thank you very much for all the papers and all the discussion. I think mostly we need more academic economics in drug and French studies in the French context as well. It's always fascinating to see the different point of view that you have on the world compared to what we live as practitioners every day. And I guess the question that we raise very often in France right now is, what's the difference between a very costly drug and a drug that is too costly, too expensive? And I think Philippe just touched on this with the cost effectiveness analysis. And the issue that we have is that financing a drug can be an investment to save other resources or to save money from the future, for example. The issue that we have right now in France is that we are looking at our drug budget in isolation, and we are pricing drugs compared to other drugs. We are not looking at what happens to other resources outside of the drug budget. So if you look at this, any costly new drugs that comes your way is just a budget disruption because you want to constrain your budget. You don't want it to grow by more than X%. So if you get a very costly new drug, it's just going to derail your perfect growth pattern for the next few years. What happens also is that we are looking at our budget in isolation each year from the next. So this investment mentality is hard to find because in that way, you're sure of the money that you're going to spend today, but you have uncertainty on what is going to gain you tomorrow. So investment is hard to defend. And we have medical economics, but as for drug pricing, it's set in a very constraining legal setting. And I explained our medical economics to an economist recently. He looked at me and said, "How dare you? This is not economics." So we have a bit of work to do still to explain what we're looking at in our efficiency models to use it better to document the investment and to answer this question: is this drug costly or is it too costly? Is it a question of cash flow or is it a question of value right now? And the uncertainty is part of it, because if you know that you're spending something today and your return in the future is uncertain, you can understand the regulator who wants to be sure of what he's going to spend. And you mentioned, Philippe, the case for gene therapies, which promise an effect for life, but can only show it over the past few years or past few months. How can I be sure that the money that I'm spending today in this drug is going to translate in more efficiency for my system in the future? The other issue that we have still, by looking at our drug budget in isolation, pricing drug in isolation, is that we don't look at change management. I have a very costly new drug that is probably very disruptive for the hospital setting as well, how we are going to treat patients in the future, how we are going to use resources differently. And currently, this change management is not anticipated. So when the drug arrives, it arrives in the current system, in the current setting on how we do things. And we see the cost of what we do currently plus the cost of the drug, and not the cost of the alchemy between the changes that are going to happen. And maybe the last question I want to raise is, what is price? In our French setting, price is something we pay for drugs. It's what a drug is going to cost me. And price can also be something we use for another purpose. We're talking a lot about, sorry, I'm starting to find the words in English, but having the drugs available on the French soil, on the European soil. So the industry part of it. Is price something that we use for industrial purposes for the European territory or the French territory? Is price something that we use to steer research in one direction or another? And currently, the way we do things, pricing drugs versus drugs that are already here in the same domain, means that if you are an innovation in a field where nothing has happened in the past 40 years, your price is incremental compared to drugs that don't cost anything anymore. So you are not incentivized to innovate in these fields?
Thank
So on this very easy question.
Thank you, Juliette. I have again remarks, but David maybe first.
Thank you, Pierre. So first, a question for you. Which country has the best healthcare in the world? Do I hear France? Yeah, so the World Health Organization years ago ranked France #1. I think the World Health Organization has only done this ranking once. That's a bit controversial. We Americans were deeply offended that we were ranked 37th. But here I am an American to give you my, I'm from the number 37 country and I'm here to tell you my opinion.
You are #1 in financing innovation, so I think you can speak.
Good. Okay, good. Thank you. So first of all, just want to build on some remarks by Juliette and Philippe. First, Juliette, with regard to budgets. One more question, then I'll stop asking questions. What share of national income does France spend on pharmaceuticals? So I think France, like the United States, spends about 20% of its healthcare budget on drugs. So in the US and France, it's about 20% on drugs. I think France is about 10% of national income on healthcare. So 20% of 10% is 2%. So Juliette talked about the budget. Now for Philippe, he doesn't get the whole GDP to select from, of course. So he has to do his best with the budget. But from a country perspective, 2% of national income is not massive. So a given drug might be very expensive for a patient. It might be very expensive for Philippe, given his budget. But for a country, spending 2%, we talk a lot about the United States that this drug is going to break the bank, but I'm skeptical of that argument. Building on a couple of points from Philippe, I was delighted to say that he views incremental cost effectiveness analysis favorably. France already has a pretty good system, pricing based on value. And in fact, Margaret Kyle introduced me to this system because as an academic, it's a nice metric of the added value of a drug. So as we as academics want some metric about how much better this drug is than that drug, it's a useful metric for us. But that at least has some reflection on value, although I like even better what the British do with regard to cost effectiveness analysis. Of course, I think Philippe said that what really matters here is the threshold you use. What's the value? What's the quality adjusted value of a life year? And I think the British are very cheap in this regard at 20,000 to 30,000 pounds per quality adjusted life year, I think is very low. I understand limited resources. I also understand that most countries have very little effect on incentives for innovation. And in fact, if you disaggregated the United States, I think each state would love to pay very low prices for drugs because each individual state would have almost no effect on innovation. And each state tries to. You know, Colorado has this new board that decides whether a drug is reasonably priced or not. So it's not clear that the federal law will allow this. But each state in the United States would love to say we're going to pay lower prices because each individual state has very little effect. On Monday, I attended a seminar in here. Professor Ariel Pecos was in here and he wagged his finger a little bit. He said that he and Professor Kate Ho have a paper documenting free riding, but it's again, very understandable. And it's something we as individual states would do if we could, but perhaps there's maybe some potential for collective action, the sort of collective action we've seen with regard to climate change.
Thank you, David. That was a very good remark. So, and it comes back to my initial thoughts when Philippe was talking about the fact that some companies may like a single price for the world. I think it's not totally true because it's accepted that price could be different and not uniform across countries, of course, according to income. I mean, and we can. I don't think the pharma company who are free to set price in a few countries, I don't think they adopt the same price everywhere. Of course, then there is a question of the interaction between this price setting, which may not be uniform, because of different constraints, the need of the drugs that may be different, the population, the demographics, the income, etc. So the demand for different treatments may be different. In the US, you have much more obesity than we have in France. So of course, and much more diabetes. So the demand for diabetes drugs is going to be very different in the two countries. So it's going to generate price differences. There is no question on this. And I don't think that you would have a single price even if there was no regulation. The problem is when you have a regulation together with this non-uniform pricing and all these spillovers that are sometimes explicitly given as we do in France. I think very unfortunately we use a lot of reference pricing in Europe. I don't think it's a good idea, and it generates so many perverse effects, including delays in access, etc. So I'm not going to talk too much about this because it's not really the question of today, but it is related. So when you will have very innovative therapies, so maybe Juliette can give us examples. There will be some very great innovation against hemophilia, for example, in a few years. They are going to be very expensive. And if we have still these perverse reference pricing effects, it may be that access to this very innovative product is going to be delayed in countries that are referred as low-price countries by other places. And this is where it makes it very complicated. So maybe, Juliette, you have a few remarks on this, because I know you know well this.
Yes, maybe a quick word on international reference pricing. We did a study a couple of years back where we showed that France was actually referenced in one way or another in between 40 and 50 countries all over the world. So not only in Europe, but all over the world. And in the dynamics that Philippe described earlier, where companies are now defending a global price, I think we can see some worry about changes in the US, where the idea of referencing European price in the US is worrying for companies which are currently differentiating those prices and may have an effect in what the companies will be able to negotiate in Europe tomorrow as well.
Yeah. So to come back to the very costly innovation. So, and then maybe you want to, Philippe, you want to add something? No. Come back to the very costly innovation. Imagine that you have a hemophilia or something very serious, and we have potentially an innovation whose marginal cost of production is going to be very high because it's a gene therapy, because it's something that needs to be designed for yourself. So I have examples, for example, in another area in vaccines against some types of cancer, okay, that are currently developed. There will be individual vaccines against this type of cancers. And in Toulouse, the Oncopole, I mean, the cancer hospital is developing these. They are doing clinical trials. We know the marginal cost of production of these individual therapies are going to be very high, like hundreds of thousands of euros. Should we pay for that? So there is a question of affordability, but I think if we look at the long run, the question is a little bit different, because by paying for this, you give access to some treatments that are going to become more routine, and maybe in the long run, they will become cheaper. If you don't do it, then you delay the process of learning by doing, and all the efficiency gains you can have by and the scale economies that you can develop. So theoretically, and then I know there are a lot of constraints from the regulatory point of view, it makes totally sense sometimes to pay very, very high price with a commitment that you will accept very much lower price in the future, which is very difficult because it means long-term commitment on both sides, on the side of the industry and on the side of the buyer. And so I was thinking, okay, this is totally outside of the current framework or these dynamics commitment, where you would say, I buy this first, you need this 10, for this 10 cancer vaccine this year at 500,000 euro, but with a commitment that in 5 years it will be 50. And there are reasons to believe that this could be, and when you discuss with the industry, that this could be a feasible mechanism from their point of view. So I wanted to mention this because I think this should be discussed later on by in the negotiation for the future frameworks in France and in Europe.
A few comments. You made different points. First, I will not insist too much on that, but about the single price, the global price. Of course, they know that there will not be a single price. My point is that the pharmaceutical company, they pre-announce a global price. And then it happens what happens, but they pre-announce a price. And then there is a pressure on us about this price, at least to have it as a list price, if not as a net price. But we have those kind of pressure. And then even if we look at the net price, we have the same kind of pressure. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, we have a new gene therapy. The name is Zynteglo. And they came from the US and they came to France, Europe, France, Germany, Italy, and as you know, it's not a unified system, so they had to negotiate country by country. But it seems that we had more or less the same willingness to pay. And then they failed to get the price they wanted in Germany. And so they said, well, we are withdrawing from the European market because we cannot get the same range of price, at least, as in the US. So this is a pressure we feel. That's my first point. Then about the marginal cost of production. It's interesting because a debate we have outside of the academic world about the marginal cost of production is exactly the opposite of the question you were asking, because most people say those innovative products are too costly. And the proof is that if we look at the marginal cost of production, it's much, much lower than the claim by the company. So we have some pressure. It's more at the political level, it's in the public debate to set the price according to the marginal cost of production. And I don't remember the name of the product at the moment, but there is one example that is very often quoted in this respect at the moment, is that one product that is manufactured in Barcelona, in Spain at the moment, for 20% or 10% of the official price. So
no, that's a good point. So up to now, most drugs were simple molecules where people were not caring too much about the marginal cost because marginal cost was indeed super small. And then the price was something else. It was not to pay for the marginal cost of production. It was to pay to reward innovation, to reward access, etc. But what I'm saying is that with these new technologies that may raise a lot the marginal cost of production, and then you may indeed argue that there is an incentive for the industry to try to overstate this cost. But this is going to make negotiation even more difficult because there is clearly a price below which they will not be able to produce. So that was.
And then your third point, on which I wanted to react, is about the possibility to plan some cut in prices over time. We can do it. But usually what we do is that we don't set some predefined deadlines saying in year 4, it will be minus 10% and so on. Most of the time, what we do is try to have some kind of contingent approach saying if this event happens, such as a new competitor that is less costly, or a new evaluation assessment by the National Health Authority, then we will renegotiate the price. This is what we do. And there is one thing that we try to plan in a more directive way, which is, the objective is to prevent companies to deter entry into the market. So we would like to support competition. And for that, we have one tool that was not mentioned in the previous session, which is that as I already said, we have the list price and then we have the net price. Okay, which means that it's quite convenient for everybody in order to reach an agreement on the net price, because the company gets what it wants a signal, and the price signal internationally is given by the list price. And we get what we want because the net price is lower. So it's very convenient. And when it's set, everybody is complaining. But initially, everybody is happy. But then it means some opacity as regards the actual price, the net price. And when you, after 10 years, when the product is going to lose its protection, intellectual property, the patent, then the competitor, the potential competitor, needs to have some knowledge of what is the actual price. And in many cases, at this stage, even after 10 years, we still have a difference between the list price and the net price. So something that we are proposing to our colleagues from the industry is to be very strict in this respect and to say that before the generic products come to the market, we need to have list price equals net price. So this is transparency, and this lowers the barriers to entry. So this we can plan it in advance.
Okay, thank you. So, Juliette or David, if you want, and then maybe we'll take some questions.
No, it's not that I don't agree. It's that this reference pricing between countries that we observe in innovation, we also observe it sometimes after loss of exclusivity. Sometimes even in the generics or biosimilars market, it's something that we observe, and our companies just alert to the fact that if the French price is significantly lower in a context where sometimes drug become a rare resources, then the French market might be deprioritized. Hence, some discussions that we might have in this respect, but we'll find an agreement, I'm sure.
So Pierre, you asked about high marginal cost products, and I gave the answer earlier. We should just use cost effectiveness analysis, and it might not be cost effective then, and then we wait until it gets cheaper. But then you said, well, maybe that's endogenous. So maybe using it now causes it to get cheaper later. And I actually don't know the research on this. Maybe you've written on this.
I'm working on it.
Okay, good. Oh, that's fantastic. Because we need to know this. And maybe in the pharma setting, we can also learn from green tech also that we're subsidizing green tech because we think this will get cheaper. But if it's endogenous, that makes a strong case for spending now and erring on the side of innovation.
Yeah. Thank you. We can continue the discussion or maybe take some questions because we have 15 minutes and I know that otherwise we won't have time, and then see some of you may have questions. Raise your hand, Katarina.
Okay, so it's just a clarification question with respect to France. So I always thought that in France, the net price was equal to the list price.
Sorry?
I always thought that in France, the list price was equal to the net price. So
It's not.
can you explain me how it works?
So the law says that
No, I mean, if I go to the pharmacy, let me just give an example.
Yeah.
So I pay for the drug, I have the net price, and I'm reimbursed from. Okay, so
So that's
being
the
cheated
difference.
by the government.
So maybe that's something we didn't explain, but Pierre touched upon this a bit earlier. We have different prices in the French market. For most products, those you can buy at the pharmacy, you have a national price, which is public, on which you have the price that's paid, the manufacturer price, plus everything we pay for distribution and the pharmacist to get payment on the service of delivering the drug. This is reimbursed in part by Social Security, in part by the patient him or herself or the insurance. And on the total sales that the company makes, they can award a proportion back to Social Security at the end of the year. So there is a net price that is a financial agreement between Social Security and the manufacturer at the end of the year based on the sales that were made this given year. So there is a list price, the manufacturer list price, the list price that is seen by the public with all the taxes and distribution costs. And there is the net price that is known only by the manufacturer and Social Security, which is after all financial agreements have been paid. And there is a net price after adding specific taxes on the drug market in France, which is even lower than what the agreement states between the manufacturer and Social Security.
Maybe one precision on this. You write on 95% of the products. If you look at the number of products, it is less than 5% of the products for which we have a difference between the list price and the net price. But if you look in terms of the value of those products, it's the most costly and the most innovative products on which we have the most differences between the two. And it can reach, in some cases, 50%. In some cases, it's even more. But in most cases, it's less than that. And of course, these prices are confidential. We don't publish them. But nonetheless, we publish some average for each group of drugs. We give an average of the difference between list and net price.
Katarina, use the microphone because otherwise. Sorry.
And those 5%, most of them are 100% financed by Social Security, I guess. I mean, those where you have a difference, you don't have the patient paying for them.
Yes, and most of them are hospital drugs as well,
Okay.
which is 100% funded by Social Security.
Okay.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I've studied the German system, which has many similarities, of course, to the French system, but also some differences. I wanted to ask something. So I was at an event a couple of weeks ago where I listened to a bunch of primarily medical device manufacturers tell me what they think the new European Joint Health Technology Assessment Regulation means for them. And so I was going to ask specifically, David, this is not a question for you, I'm sorry, but for the other two speakers, the question is, so maybe you could sort of say a bit about, so what I would love to understand is what this means for your work. So if we're going to, within Europe, go about harmonizing health technology assessments for, I guess, cancer drugs as of January 1st. We heard about those in the last session, and then medical devices and everything else sometime before the end of the decade. What does that mean for your work is my first question, because so much of the work is so country and context specific. And then related, Juliette, I was thinking a lot about something you said, and something that I've written about is just that the sort of this conversation about sort of the marginal cost of production, I actually thought was almost like frustrating, because when we talk about gene therapies and cell therapies, we're talking about like a lot of healthcare production, but not a lot of actual pharmaceutical manufacturing. We're talking about extraordinarily costly hospital stays, and sort of how should I think about, like, I think the marginal cost of production is an increasingly less relevant concept when we talk about these very costly therapies. And so how do you see that fitting in going forward? And then, but the EU question is, and then the sort of, if you could put the spin on it of like, what would you like to see academic health economists ask about based on the answers? I would, of course, be particularly curious about that.
So the easy part, health technology assessment in Europe. So the it's coming in place from January for some drugs. What happens is that the reimbursement decision and the pricing decision stay at the state level. So our work is going to be mostly the same in the future. The question that we have as drug industry is how it can affect positively what happens in the French setting. To give a bit more context, we have long access delays in France compared to other countries and European countries. And I see we have some circumventing of that because we have specific dispositions to help very innovative drugs get faster to the first patient in France. But overall, if you look at the rules, the set of rules for everyone, the actual date for coming in France for everyone is a bit longer in France than in other countries. So what we are hoping is that the sequential process that we have currently, HTA, once you get HTA, you start negotiating your price. And once your price is negotiating, it still has to get published. And this is a step in itself. And we hope that the HTA part will be accelerated by what's going to happen in Europe. It's not very clear right now how it can accelerate what happens in France, but we are working with it's more the HES, the health, health authority, sorry, that works with us on this, on how it can accelerate their HTA process in France based on the work that will be done at the European level. For your second question, I guess what we see in France is that for hospital stays and for very costly drug, they are separated from the rest of the costs of the hospital in taking the patient in charge. So for most of the drugs, what happens is that the hospital has to pay for the drug and fit it in its budget. For very costly drug, they can ask for a specific reimbursement for the drug on top of what they get for treating the patient. But the question you ask is related to change management for me. We saw that a couple of years back with the first CAR T cells, which arrived on the market and then triggered the changes inside the hospitals to make it happen. And what we're seeing is that it's maybe going to be the same with these very costly drugs, which will entail very costly procedures. We'll need to change the actual medical time spent in the hospitals to treat a single patient, maybe change the security or the processes within the hospital. And this is something that's not necessarily been anticipated in the French setting. We are doing an horizon scanning exercise as well. We see that the nature of these gene therapies is also changing in the future from cells that you modified outside the patient's body or cells that you modified inside the patient's body. And we see that some technologies that have been the first one being developed are actually maybe going to slow down a bit in the future to see other technologies come up. So the industry is doing this work a bit by themselves, because in the French setting, it's hard to discuss this prospective changes that would need to happen in the hospitals to make the drug possible in the French setting.
Maybe a comment. So first, coming on the first question about the European HTA, what I have understood is that the benefit of this will be so that we don't replicate nationally the HTA assessment. And I hope this will be the case. That's the spirit of this European HTA for cancer drugs, etc. So I hope this will be used. But of course, it means that the regulation or the law needs to be changed also nationally, because there will not be the same criteria for evaluation, because this will be a European level criteria. So maybe a comment on the marginal cost of production, high or low, etc. I think this is true that for these gene therapies, a lot of the cost is also the cost in terms of administrating the drug and looking at all the side effects and all the. I mean, this is much more complicated than a standard drug. So I have an example where here in the cancer hospital in Toulouse, they are doing clinical trials for a vaccine. So I was talking earlier about a vaccine against some head and neck cancers, where the technology is very promising, and basically it's extremely costly because it's a gene modification technology where you take some cells of the tumor of the patient, you send it to to these biotech companies that is isolating. I don't know. They are doing a lot of things with genes. They are doing a lot of artificial intelligence design, and then they modify some genes that they introduce in a virus that will serve as a vector, and you inject so it comes back to the patient. You inject it, and then 50%, 90%, I don't remember, they get cured and they don't have really. But of course, this treatment has a lot of. You have to be very cautious. So it's very costly to manage in terms of medical side effects, etc. And what they claim, what this hospital is claiming, is that currently this is financed by the clinical trials by the companies. But there is no way we can pay for that in the future. So if you are not in the clinical trials, you will not have access to it. So that's one of the issues that how do we deal with that?
First it depends on the precise figures, because the points you made are right, but then the same the price of such gene therapies. I don't know whether you're familiar with that. We're talking about claims that range between 1 million and 3.5 million euros for one injection. It's not exactly one injection because there are some preparation and so on and so on. But so it will be costly and we will pay for it. But maybe the company will claim 3 million and will say that, 1 million is enough. And then we have a negotiation. But you're right on the principles, but then we have to check into the details of the figures.
We have time for a couple of last questions.
One quick question and one quick comment about marginal cost. So the first one is about reference pricing. And you mentioned that people threaten or firms threaten that they will leave the market or can. I just wanted to know how many times have they actually carried out such a threat of leaving, a large market like European market, even if the price is lower. And the second is just this one quick point on the marginal cost. Is the right place to look for what's the right pricing model and reimbursement for higher marginal costs is to go and look in the healthcare, in the hospital sector. People have open heart surgeries and other things going on which have very high marginal costs associated with them. Should we be looking over there to see what might be the right model for reimbursing these new costly innovative therapies in the drugs market as well?
Maybe, Philippe, you're the one for the first question, as the CEPS has started to track the negotiations that don't go to their ends. And some reasons might be the firm leaving the market. Some might find other reasons. It's something that has been talked about for a long time in France, but innovations were still arriving in the market. And we're starting to see examples as Zynteglo, but it's hard from my point of view to actually give a figure on that.
Yes, actually, I gave one example because this is the one I have in mind, and it was not a refusal to go to France; it was a refusal to come to Europe. Actually, it happens that some products decide not to come to the French market, but as regards innovative products, it's very, very unusual, very, very rare. I mentioned the ranking by the National Authority for Health. The ranking goes from 1 to 5. If you look at the ranking 1 to 3, which are the main innovative products, I have no example in mind of one product that has decided not to come to the French market in the past few years. Maybe a few of them, I don't have them in mind at the moment. So it's quite unusual. And then And then you were, Juliette, mentioning some products that some companies that can make such decisions. We have not to put in the same basket new products and innovative products, because yes, it happens that new products don't come to France, but usually it's products that have got a bad or an average ranking.
On marginal costs and the cost of procedures, the way of setting the hospital payments for patient treatment is very specific in France as well. I don't know how they manage this cost of very costly procedures. We know that it's a yearly discussion between my colleagues for hospitals and the government, so it may not be that easy, but it's a good idea to go and check how they're doing things.
Just a really quick example of a drug that didn't launch in a country. You might remember the Vertex's cystic fibrosis drugs quite famously did not launch in the UK because they were not deemed cost effective at that threshold.
I sit on a committee, a national committee in Canada that looks at for access and reimbursement, so covering new drugs. And one question that I have, and maybe Philippe will have an idea of how to deal with that, but around the pricing transparency is when a new drug comes into market or when they apply to come to market, that we examine the value, the effectiveness of the drug, but then the pricing is compared to whatever is available on the market on their list price. As you mentioned, the negotiated price are not available to us. So all we have the ICERs and et cetera, but it's always compared with the list prices of the available drugs. And so in the end, I find that our analysis is biased when we're looking at the value of a new product because they're comparing it to with a price that is not the actual of what we're paying. So I'm wondering how, or like avenues or solutions to that issue in the context of the absence of transparency on prices.
Thank you. This is a tricky issue for negotiation. But what happens, in practice, when we have a new product and we have some comparators, and we at the CEPS, we know the net price. So what we are going to negotiate is a net price for the newcomer that is consistent with the net price of the comparator. But the problem is, and you're right in terms of the lack of transparency, is that the newcomer, usually, it doesn't know the net price of the comparator. And we are not allowed to tell him precisely the net price of the comparator because it's supposed to remain confidential. So then it's a matter of trust, but we are committed to give some indications or order of magnitude, but without explaining the details of the confidential contract we have with the competitors. So there is some kind of asymmetry of information. And on the other side, there is another kind of asymmetry of information, which is that the company we are negotiating with have a good knowledge of the international net prices of his product, and we don't. So we have two different asymmetries of information. It's a bit tricky, but usually in the end, there is some misunderstanding at the beginning of the negotiation because the company will tell us, well, it's not possible. The difference between the list price and the net price of my competitor is so large. And we have to say, yes, it is. You're not going to have the precise figures, but we can tell you that it's in the order of more than 20%, for instance.
maybe a quick comment, because from the outside, a company may be a single entity. What happens very frequently is that the French subsidiary actually doesn't know the net prices in other countries. So there is an asymmetry of information in theory, but in practice, the people in the room have quite the same information about the international prices. And regarding the treatment of different companies in the same field, a representative of our competitive authorities sits in Philippe's committee, so it helps building trust in this respect as well.
Thank you. So unfortunately, I think we have to stop. Thanks a lot for this very interesting roundtable. I think we could talk more, so maybe we'll do it next year. We'll continue this conversation. But thanks a lot for everybody. So we have the last session of the day. So I propose that we have a 2-minute break for those who need, and we start at 45. Okay? So everything is delayed by 15 minutes.